Picture this. You're walking through New York in September of 2026, caffeine in your hand, your phone bright with headlines, your life still pretending to be normal. And underneath the glass towers and the busy streets, the economy isn't collapsing like a movie scene. It's dying quietly, like a body that lost oxygen hours ago. And nobody realized until the breathing stopped. The brutal truth is this: most people don't experience a crash until it's already inside their routines, not inside their headlines, inside their habits, inside their bank accounts, inside their belief that the future is something you can borrow from. This video is not here to comfort you. It's here to rip off the soothing story you've been using to fall asleep at night. Because in 2026, the crash era isn't just about money going down. It's about trust going down. It's about the part of you that keeps saying it'll be fine, and then acting surprised when reality doesn't care about your coping mechanism. Welcome to the Hidden Self, where we talk about the uncomfortable patterns people bury so they can keep moving, buying, gambling, and pretending. What you're about to hear is not financial advice. It's a psychological map. It shows you why people stay calm right up until the moment they're not calm anymore. It shows you why systems lie in advance, and why crowds applaud the lie. And it shows you the one warning signal that doesn't care about speeches, polls, or social media influencers. It's older than modern finance. And it keeps repeating the same lesson. When the future becomes untrustworthy, everything built on optimism becomes a trap. Let's start with the signal people ignore because it doesn't sound dramatic enough. When you hear yield curve, your mind probably tries to treat it like a graph you can't emotionally understand. That's exactly the trick. The yield curve is not a news story. It's a diagnosis. It tells you what the market expects, but it does it through interest rates, not through panic. And the hidden self always hates signals like that because signals give you a choice. They force action. They force you to admit uncertainty. In a healthy world, when the government borrows for longer periods, the interest rate should be higher than when it borrows for short periods. That extra return is the price of waiting and the price of risk. It's the market saying, yes, time matters. Yes, uncertainty exists. Pay me for both. But when the yield curve inverts, the market flips the message. It becomes, the future looks worse than the present. Short-term borrowing becomes more expensive than long-term borrowing. That is not a vibe. That is a survival instinct embedded into pricing. Here's how the hidden self responds. If you're invested, you want the future to be stable because stability is what justifies your story. So you tell yourself, inversion happens sometimes. It's not guaranteed. You're not analyzing. You're bargaining with reality. You're using intellectual doubt as emotional anesthesia. And the market has a record, spanning decades, of inversion followed by recession. Not because the curve predicts like a magic crystal ball. It predicts because it reflects fear and liquidity pressure. It predicts because money smart enough to move doesn't need your confidence. It just needs incentives. The deeper point is this: inversion is the economy confessing its own fear. It's the system saying, we can't trust long-term growth enough to price it cheaply. And then, because the crash doesn't arrive like a meteor, people keep their faces on. They keep posting, they keep buying, they keep assuming that the future is a continuation of the present. Now, in 2026, the curve had already turned back at the end of 2025. Officials tried to calm everyone. They used words like landing softly, managed adjustments, resilience. They spoke the language of control because control is what crowds want to believe in. But mathematics doesn't do propaganda. Mathematics counts. The real story begins not in the polished towers, but in the places where people pay with reality. The suburbs, old parking lots, the dealership rows that look permanent until they suddenly aren't. In the middle of 2025, companies that served car financing for working families quietly collapsed. Quietly. No spectacle. No global apology tour. Just a shuttered storefront and a sudden disappearance of credit. And here's the psychological mechanism most people never connect. When working-class credit breaks, consumer demand stops being a theory and becomes a wound. People can't upgrade their mindset out of a payment they can't afford. They can't manifest a check. They can't negotiate with interest rates. When those families run out of borrowing capacity, the foundation underneath spending rots. The economy isn't just slowing down. It's losing its unpaid invoices. It's losing the automatic engine of consumption. And then, behind the scenes, the system panics the only way it knows how. Not by telling the truth, by injecting liquidity. That sounds technical, but psychologically it's the same as lying to a drowning person with a rope. The water still rises. The person still gasps. You just hope the rope delays the inevitable. In 2026, liquidity support reminded people of 2008, the same era of backroom rescues and emergency language. It was called adjustment. The people who understand the code called it CPR, and you can almost hear the confession inside that phrase. The patient is failing, and we are trying to hide it from the public because public knowledge changes behavior. Because if the public believes the patient is dying, the public will stop cooperating. The hidden self is cooperative only when it feels safe. Once it feels unsafe, cooperation becomes instinct. People withdraw, people hoard, people sell before they lose everything. That brings us to the next uncomfortable truth. In a crash era, the scariest predator is the one who isn't panicking. Look at what the smart money did. While crowds chased the next wave of AI profits and token dreams, the giants started moving like animals that smell blood long before the crowd sees the mess. Not with dramatic speeches, with spreadsheets, with trimming, with cutting risk and parking capital in weapons that survive chaos. There is a reason the most legendary investor in modern history keeps returning to cash during periods like this. It isn't because cash is glamorous. It isn't because cash produces adrenaline. Cash is boring until the world becomes desperate. Then cash becomes power. The common delusion is that money is made by guessing, but the hidden self knows something else. Real survival is made by preparation. The investor who holds cash isn't missing out. He's waiting for mispricing. He's waiting for fear to push prices below value so he can buy when the crowd is too emotional to act rationally. In 2024 and 2025, major players sold aggressively. They reduced exposure to expensive narratives and expensive banks and expensive optimism, and they stacked liquidity in short-term government instruments at a scale that practically rewrites what people think normal investing looks like. Ask yourself why that matters psychologically. It matters because it destroys your favorite story, that everyone is in the same game and everyone gets treated fairly. They don't. The people who control timing are never the people who panic first. The people who panic first usually do so because they lack options. When you depend on the market to be calm in order for your life plan to work, you become dependent in a way you don't admit. You don't just invest. You outsource your future to the mood of strangers. And then, when the mood changes, you discover your dependency like discovering a trapdoor under your feet. In 2026, the great withdrawal of liquidity by large institutions creates a different kind of pressure, not just a price drop, a market plumbing problem. When big players step back, there's less depth, there's less buying power at each level. The crash accelerates because there aren't enough willing buyers to cushion the fall. Now add another predator, the mechanized migration of capital. This isn't a romantic story about businessmen making clever bets. This is infrastructure money and data-driven capital moving through systems so large they can change reality without raising their voices. Think of firms like BlackRock not as a person but as an organism with sensors. They manage flows that dwarf the GDP of entire countries. They don't need to believe, they just need to allocate. In the past, people imagined investing as owning paper, stocks, bonds, claims. But in 2026, smart capital started shifting toward assets that are harder to print and harder to counterfeit with hope. They began moving into real infrastructure, energy systems, land, and properties that produce tangible cash flow. Psychologically, this exposes a truth most people avoid. You can be financially literate and still emotionally naive. You can understand the words, but not the behavior. The behavior says, smart money is losing faith in valuation games. When institutions buy real assets, they're responding to a question. The hidden self asks silently, what if the story breaks? What if the paper claims become less trustworthy than the physical world? The crash era punishes paper, not because paper is evil, because paper depends on counterparties and liquidity. Paper depends on confidence. It depends on the belief that when you want out, someone will be there to take your side of the trade. And in 2026, confidence becomes scarce. Liquidity becomes scarce. So paper starts behaving like a rumor. It exists until it doesn't. This leads into the darkest core pattern. The crash isn't one bubble. It's multiple bubbles aligning like a perfect storm. And each bubble has a different psychology behind it. In 2026, it's not only the stock market story, it's the stock market story fused with real estate fragility, fused with government bond shelter becoming less reliable. Three separate fantasies colliding in the same time window. First, the stock bubble. S&P 500 at elevated highs, but not broad-based, concentrated, lifted by a handful of mega tech names, priced like they're protected from recession, protected from human limitation. protected from legal scandal, protected from economic gravity. Their valuation says, the future is guaranteed. That's not analysis. That's denial dressed as math. And the hidden self loves denial, because denial feels like agency. If you believe the future is guaranteed, you feel powerful, you feel safe, you feel like you can keep doubling down because the universe has a contract with you. But bubbles don't care about your contract. Bubbles care about discount rates, liquidity, and earnings reality. If an AI leader misses expectations, if regulation bites, if one scandal interrupts the narrative machine, the domino effect begins. Domino effect is a mechanical term for a psychological event. People stop believing. When belief stops, selling accelerates. When selling accelerates, forced selling kicks in. When forced selling kicks in, even good assets drop because they become collateral, not investments. That's how you get contagion across markets. Not because the world changes uniformly in an hour, but because investors change behavior uniformly in panic. Second, commercial real estate. This is where the bubble shows its rot in slow motion until it suddenly looks like a corpse. Office towers can remain glossy while tenants disappear. The glass can keep reflecting light while the interior economy collapses. In many cases, landlords borrowed at ridiculously low rates when money was cheap. They assumed refinancing would remain easy. They assumed demand would return. They assumed remote work was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent lifestyle redesign. But commercial loans often mature on a shorter schedule than people expect. And when refinancing comes due in a higher rate world, the arithmetic becomes brutal. Costs triple while rent income declines. That isn't a market correction. That's solvency math breaking under pressure. So owners default. Then banks suffer losses. Then local financial institutions, which were never meant to absorb massive systemic shocks, become weak links. It's a chain, and chains don't fail politely. Third, government bonds, the supposed safe haven. In previous crises, when stocks fell, money ran into U.S. Treasuries as the least bad option. But in 2026, the shelter itself becomes crowded with doubt. Public debt is swelling, spending deficits are persistent, and foreign holders are not obligated to keep buying if they start seeing diminishing returns and political uncertainty. When demand weakens and supply keeps increasing, bond prices fall. When bond prices fall, the shelter turns into another source of pain. So the triple bubble isn't three separate waves. It's one ocean surge attacking your assets from every direction. Stocks are expensive. Real estate is fragile. Bonds stop feeling like refuge. Now think about the hidden self inside this. The hidden self tries to reduce fear by believing in a single safe asset class. People say, if everything collapses, treasuries will protect me. That's not financial planning. That's emotional comfort. It's a child's blanket made of yield curves and credit ratings. When the blanket tears, the body panics. Not because you don't understand risk, but because you do understand it too late, after your brain has already invested emotionally in the illusion. And then the next truth comes for you directly. The crash in 2026 isn't only about millionaires losing money. It's about the future becoming emotionally unaffordable for everyone. In the past, economic pain distributed itself differently. In 1929, the pain was heavier on financial elites first, then spread through jobs as unemployment grew. In 2008, pain struck housing and household stability, and governments had room to intervene with massive monetary and fiscal actions. People felt the shock, but the state still had some weapons left in its basement. In 2026, the hidden self must face something harsher. The crisis hits the future, not just the present. It hits the ability to plan. It hits retirement assumptions. It hits tuition savings. It hits the invisible safety net that many people believed would persist. If your retirement is tied to market funds and the market collapses, your old age income becomes a question mark overnight. If your children's education fund is invested in risk assets, a crash doesn't just reduce returns, it steals options, it forces hard choices. Delay school, reduce opportunities, take on debt, move, downsize, rely on family. And then consumer spending stops. The psychology is simple. When people feel their wealth shrink, they stop spending, not because of ideology, but because of survival. Survival spending means repairs, essentials, and nothing that requires trust in stable future income. Consumer confidence, the engine behind growth, dies quickly when people realize the rules changed. And once the middle class stops buying, supply chains suffer. Factories across countries slow down. Workers lose hours. Taxes fall. Governments struggle. The crash becomes global not through contagion narratives, but through job income and demand. Now, here's where the hidden self usually tries to dodge the truth. People ask, why can't the central bank save everyone the way it did before? Because the central bank is trapped between two monsters that both want the same thing: control inflation and prevent recession. Historically, it could fire two magical weapons: slash rates towards zero and unleash quantitative easing to flood liquidity. But in 2026, the trap is that using one weapon worsens the other. If you push too hard, inflation resurges. If you stop pushing, the economy freezes. It's not that leaders are incompetent. It's that the system has less maneuvering space. The basement is not full anymore. The inventory is lower. The options are fewer. This is how you get the real horror. You can't print your way out of a structural trust crisis. You can't stimulate your way out of asset repricing when people stop believing that prices represent reality. And then comes the speed. The modern financial system is not a shouting market. It's an interconnected web of algorithms, derivatives, liquidity providers, and automated liquidation mechanisms. Everything is wired together so that when one part stumbles, the rest responds within minutes rather than weeks. So imagine the first 24 hours of the worst-case scenario. At 9:30 in the morning, a major investment firm or mid-sized